I lived mostly with my grandparents, Senator and Mrs. Gore. He was blind from the age of 10, and I was precocious at reading, thanks to his brandishing his cane at me. So I would read to him. I was the only 9-year-old, probably in the United States, who understood bimetallism. He was on the Finance Committee of the Senate. And I would often act as his page, take him onto the floor of the Senate. And there were giants in those days. I mean, everybody thinks that about their childhood, but they really were. And there was Huey Long, who was the funniest man that ever lived. And Bora of Idaho, the Lion of Idaho. And they were all such performers. I mean, they were great actors. If you just studied them, you could, it was like studying the old Vic or something. And I really wanted to be a politician, but unfortunately I was born a writer. So when that happens, you have no choice in the matter. I was fascinated by politics. And the Senate was the engine room of the country. Roosevelt was president during, well, most of my childhood. Still president when I went in the Army at 17. And he was the main political fact of the country. But the Senate, full of prima donnas, and each one saw himself as very much the equal of the president, if not his superior. So there was this tug of war going on between the executive and the legislative. We're getting a small, corrupt version of it, as everything we have today is small and corrupt. But we're seeing a bit of that, where the House of Representatives is telling the executive, go get lost, you know. We're an equal power here, and you don't just break into one of our offices. But it was well, let's say I never had to take a civics course. My father was a great athlete and a great designer of airlines. He started 3 airlines. Then Roosevelt made him director of air commerce. And while he was director of air commerce, he got me to fly when I was 10 years old. You can get the Pathé newsreel footage to add to this portrait of me at 10 getting in a plane and taking off at Bowling Field in Washington in 1936. Two great subjects that are never taught. One is your body, your general health. There are many old gentlemen who go to their grave not knowing where the liver is. They just don't know. They don't know what the heart really does. They can't figure it. It's all too complicated. Nobody will tell them. The other thing is money. They never tell you how to get a mortgage. I would think at 12, I was perfectly willing to move out, you know, several times of my mother's house, not my grandfather's. I would have moved out if I could have got a second mortgage or even a first mortgage. But I was not allowed that luxury because I didn't know how to do it. The only thing interesting about the United States is our history. And start right off from the Revolution on, or even Indian Wars. Do all that. It's wildly interesting, and it's the most unpopular subject among children. I think it's Purdue, once a year, asks the graduating seniors all over the country in high schools, which subjects do you like the most, you know, and it's always packing or lunch. And which do you most hate? And it's always American history. Now, you have to be a genius to make that uninteresting. You have to really have great gifts of boredom beyond the norm available to most people. I've spent my life writing American history, feeling a bit guilty because I often think, you know, it's hard work. Why am I doing this? The school should have done it. My father was a great influence. He was a real jock. He was an all-American football player, a quarterback at West Point. Part of the great winning team of 1917. He was captain of the team. I was the mascot. They lost the game to Navy. Nobody's perfect. But his character was a great stimulus to me. He had athletes who do everything easily. And, you know, he got a silver medal for the decathlon at the Olympic Games in Antwerp in, I think it was 1924. And the great athletes are very serene. They have to be. And I remember he said, he wasn't talking to me because I was not interested in athletics, but he was talking to somebody, and he said, well, never look back. In other words, if you've missed a shot at tennis, never think about it again, go right on to the next one. And this was terribly good advice about life's hazardous ways. So I took that seriously. I was living in the middle of history, and in the summer of '39, obviously before 1940, with a group of boys from St. Albans, where I was in school, one of them being the son of Hamilton Fish, who was the great leading isolationist in the country. And we were first in France, and then we were in Mussolini's Rome, and then we were up in Chamberlain's England. And I remember standing outside number 10 Downing Street on the day that Chamberlain went to tell the House, we shall be at war with Hitler. If you're in the middle of history, and then we were on the last ship, the Athenia, out of Liverpool. There was 50-50 chance that we would not make it safely to the other shore. So all of that wakes you up to the real world. The Gore family were the founders of the Party of the People, which was first organized up in northern Mississippi, then it leaked over into Georgia, Alabama. And the Party of the People, that's where the word populist comes from. We're the original populists. And we represented the farmers who had been destroyed by the Civil War, other people who were not doing terribly well in our society, particularly what we called Indians, but now are called Native Americans. It was a party for the turbulent poor who didn't like their situation. And we promised, with great sincerity, it's an interesting party. It was also quite racist, but then the whole South was racist. My grandfather was not racist, and he lost his first race in Mississippi for Congress because he was thought to be in too close with African Americans who lived in the southern part of the state, which was governed by the Bourbons, as we call the rich white people. And we hated them just as much as the black folk did. So the Gores and the African Americans were always allies. So we were also isolationists. We believed what George Washington said. When he left office, he addressed the nation, and he advised us to mind our own business. And he said, nations, like individuals, ought not to have enemies, and they ought not to have special friends. Nations only have interests. Very good advice, which I always took seriously and still do. I'd seen a movie called A Mystery of the Blue Room, I think it was called. I can't find it in any of the encyclopedias, but I remember liking it very much. And so I wrote The Mystery of the Blue Room. Yes, I was a plagiarist very early, just borrowed it from the movie. Nobody noticed. Nobody had seen it in my family. And there I was, retelling the story. But I was using family characters. My grandmother, who was a wonderful woman, very, very intelligent, but she never listened to anybody, and she wasn't deaf. She just didn't like listening to people. She didn't like talking that much either. But, she would occasionally say something intelligent. But she would miss an entire conversation because she'd be thinking about other things. Then she would ask the subject of what we were talking about. I said, but we told you a few minutes ago. Oh, is that what it's about? And she would just drift off. So I was already using other people's characteristics to decorate my tales. At 17, I enlisted in the Army, and I served 3 years in the Pacific. And I was the first mate of an Army ship in the Aleutians. This is why I am in a wheelchair. Due to hypothermia, I had a frozen knee, which developed rheumatoid arthritis, misdiagnosis naturally by the Army. Turned out to be osteoarthrosis, and I now have an artificial knee. But the knees are the only part of the anatomy I've never had to use in life. It was a book about the absolute normality of same sexuality, as it was sometimes called. And remember, I spent all my life not only in boys' schools, but then there I am stuck in 3 years of the Army. I knew exactly what went on in the real world. It was Walt Whitman who said no one will ever know what goes on in armies. Everybody thought it was the bloodshed and so on. Oh, Whitman was after a different game. And I knew what went on in the real world, and I thought, well, why don't nobody would write about it. All the people who'd praised my war novel were suddenly hysterical over this book. And I responded in kind, being brought up by the Gores, sharp-tongued and quite mean-minded if they get angry. And I'm quite for fighting back. So I've conducted an absolute feud with the New York Times for 50 years because of what they did to that book and to me. And they're not doing very well these days. Happy to report from the front. I suspect at a very early age that one of the things I most disliked in the world was dishonesty and hypocrisy. And since the United States is firmly based on both, I had a rich subject, my native land, and certain taboo subjects were obviously going to interest me. Why, of all the founding fathers, did I pick Aaron Burr to write a book about? Well, I thought it was time that his point of view was expressed, because he's very interesting about the founding of the country. I wrote a play for something called Studio One, which was CBS. And that did well, and then I wrote 20 more plays. Hollywood beckoned. I was the last contract writer at MGM. And I didn't need the money by then. I was just doing it to see what a great studio was like, because I knew the studio system was about to vanish from the earth. It's like, observing the troglodytes at home. And it was fascinating. And by then I was on Broadway with plays. And I've supported myself by writing all my life. It's best to start writing when you wake up in the morning or afternoon or whenever it is you wake up. Just start then, because you are closer to the dream state than at any other time in the day, which means the imagination is really working on all cylinders. And it means that whatever it is that manufactures sentences in your head is very fresh. And you have all kinds of slants on things that by the end of the day you won't have, or you'll just lose along the way. Further advice I have not. I've lived in the world and taken part in many things outside myself. The problem with most American writers, they only write about themselves. And they're not very interesting. I don't care about why the marriage went wrong and why the author left his wife for the au pair girl when he did not get tenure at Ann Arbor, which really broke his heart. I mean, these books, should be written on Kleenex and disposed of. But everybody's been told in the United States that he's interesting. You're a very interesting person, I can just tell. Or my feelings are just as good as your feelings. Well, that's a fairly true statement. But what's a feeling? We all have feelings, and most of them are not worth dealing with. It's what you know. It's what you think. And if you have the gift of invention, very rare, may I say, it's what you make up. People have stopped reading novels. TV and video games have taken the place where novels were once. When I was young, everybody read them. Now it seems hardly anybody does. Publishers are screaming, but they've contributed a great deal to the collapse of the novel as a popular art form. They published too many bad books, they've overpublished all sorts of things, and then are surprised when nobody wants their wares, but that's a business decision, which has nothing to do with the creative one. You try to get it down, what it is you see, what it is you think. I used to, when I was writing my first play, my producer was a very popular playwright called George Axelrod, and very bright guy. And I was changing a TV play into a Broadway play, Visit to a Small Planet. And I would just knock out a couple of scenes in 20, 30 minutes. He said, don't write. He said, think, don't write. I said, George, I only think when I write. I have no idea what I think about anything until I've written it. And sometimes I'm quite surprised, and sometimes I'm quite appalled. But anyway, this is how you get it done. I wanted to be elected, and a friend of mine, Jack Kennedy, was running for president. It seemed like the thing to do that year. And I had a play on Broadway, which is a political play called The Best Man. Where it's fascinating for a political activist like myself, forget a novelist. I don't think in terms of people's occupations. I wanted to see how much strength my ideas had out there. Well, you can only do that if you run. Because you can't do it by reading newspapers and listening to journalists. So I introduced all sorts of things in 1960 that shocked even my friend Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very much behind my race. When I came out openly in Dutchess County, of all places, which is very right-wing, for the recognition of Red China at the United Nations. Oh, well, they must first agree. Even she was getting nervous at what I was doing. I said, look, I've been talking to these people for nearly 2 years. I went there was 5 counties. It's the biggest district in New York. I said, I've been talking for years with all sorts of different people. None of them can understand why Red China has been excluded from the United Nations, since they've got 1 billion people or whatever it was then. And it did me no harm. And of course, you learn a lot from them, because they do know their own interests. I was told the facts of life by Senator Cranston, who was a very nice guy. He said, you know what you're getting in for? I said, yeah, of course I do. He said, okay, say you by some miracle, you get elected to a first term in the Senate, and you want a second term. Most of us do. He said, you have to raise $10,000 a week for your entire first term of 6 years. You can do the math. 6 times 52 is a lot of money. It means you're on the phone every day begging people for money. And I've never asked anybody for any money that I can think of in my life. I've never had a bank loan or a mortgage. Well, I did have one mortgage, which I paid off as quickly as I could. When I graduated from Exeter, I went straight into the Army. That was 1943. But I'd already passed the college board to go to Harvard. So I had a choice when my first book was coming out. I was getting out of the Army in 46. Would I go to Harvard, where most of my classmates who had survived the war were going? And I said, no, I've been in institutions all my life. Why go to another one, having just got rid of the Army? So I've always had nice relations with Harvard, and all of my archives are there, manuscripts and so forth. So as I always say, I myself did not go to Harvard, but I sent my work there, where they've been very good about cataloging. I like the inventions, as I call them, like Myra Breckinridge, Duluth. These are totally invented universes. Anybody can describe Abraham Lincoln's life. Well, not many people can invent my Duluth, which I had to move, from the northern part of the country down to. I put it a little too close to New Orleans. I don't know what shape my Duluth is in now. It may be a bit wet, but I moved it down there. And I have a group of enraged Hispanics called the Aztec terrorists who are trying to take over the town. And I've got 2 lady writers, one of whom cannot spell and reads with great difficulty, but she's very, very famous. And she's won the Wurlitzer Prize. It's the name of a rather good young novelist, or he used to be young when I knew of him. Wurlitzer, and because she keeps repeating it because it sounds like Pulitzer, but it didn't come her way. And it's about irreality. Everything changes. Once you think you understand what a situation is, it proves not to be the case. It's something else. And there's a spaceship in it, filled with giant cockroaches. And everybody's bored by it. Nobody wants to even open the thing. They just say it's going to be boring. So the spaceship sits there through most of the book. Then it plays a part at the end. It's not living up to expectation. It's a nice thing to do in prose. It was 72, and Nixon had just beaten McGovern, and I was lecturing at this big old 19th century building in Boston. Something Hall, what's it called? Not Fannel, it's a big red brick 19th century building. Jordan Hall. And I was opening a season. And there were about 4 galleries, and it was packed. And I had a new speech, which is always awful to give. I ended up having to read it, which is even worse. So it was getting pretty depressing. But when I came to questions and answers, it got very lively. And Elaine Noble, who later became the first lesbian assemblywoman in Massachusetts. She was in the gallery. I didn't know who she was. She was just in the gallery. We met later. She asked me, how do you explain that Massachusetts is the only state that voted against Nixon in the last election? I said, well, I can flatter you by saying this is the Athens of America. Dutiful applause. I said, I'm not going to do that. I think I should remind you that since the beginning of the Republic, Massachusetts has been the most corrupt state in the Union, and you know a crook when you see one. Well, the eruption of applause, it was like a tsunami hitting you. It pushed me about 2 feet back of the lectern. I've never felt anything quite like that. A lot of novels, I suspect, come out of people who have been severely shocked at some point in their lives and never quite knew how to live with the shock. So they want to reconstruct it by writing about it. It's just kind of obvious therapy. The art novel is something more special, and that comes out of a deep knowledge of the art, such as you get in Henry James, who really was our greatest novelist, and he never thought of anything else but fiction itself, the perfect phrase, the perfect encounter, the perfect clash. The Golden Bowl is full of the most astonishing scenes, and his imagination just was so driven in that book that it's like nothing else. It's the only explanation I could ever come up with about Vietnam. How dare this inferior little people, we thought, although basically their civilization is much older than ours, how dare they defy us? How dare Panama? We're going to go down there and seize their leader and throw him into prison, even though we have no rights, legal rights over him at all. That was Noriega. So then we get a narrative together. Oh, he's in charge of all the drugs on earth. And he's a great admirer of Adolf Hitler. Did you know that? He's got a copy of Mein Kampf beside. Oh, no, yes. God, he must be evil. Yes, he is. All these evil people they find everywhere on earth. Well, they could look in the mirror occasionally if they wanted to see something really evil.